So welcome, John. This is my good
Thank
friend,
you.
John Eckert, who has come to join us today for Ask the Expert. I'm Linda Tuck Chapman, CEO of Third Party Risk Institute. And I have to say, John, I'm just delighted to have you back on. You have such a wealth of experience. I've known you now, well, we're talking just exactly 10 years. So
Yes.
do you want to talk about how we met? It'll give you a
I
little
think
bit of
initially we
background.
met, what conference was that?
It was the RMA, the Risk Management Association's
Was
first.
it?
It was the
it
very
G-Corp?
first
Okay.
third-party risk management roundtable right after 2013-29 came out.
Yeah, and then we crossed paths again at other conferences because
Mhm.
at the time, 2013-29 was the hot topic. I mean, that was being discussed, and I know a lot of discussion at G-Corp about it. I remember Comptroller Curry at the time actually came and in his introduction speech or the opening speech, G-Corp specifically discussed third-party risk management, and then just presentations over that, and then just going forward, just have been tremendous.
Well,
So,
John, I know you're very modest. Perhaps you could share with us your role in the creation of 2013-29, which in my mind, before the interagency guidance, honestly, John, the high watermark worldwide in terms of guidance and the quality of the guidance itself. So
yeah,
what was your role in that?
well, my role was actually, Linda, I accepted the position as Director of Governance and Operational Risk Policy for the OCC in DC in April of 2013. And literally, when I walked in the door, they said, your key project is to get this third-party guidance out. From 2013-29, back then, they still do it sometimes. They'll put the name of somebody as the point of contact. But I in all modesty, I was just the point of contact. 2013-29 was one huge collaborative effort at the agency. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of people involved. And then I was just, as I say, I was lucky enough that being the point of contact, and I was the one going out on the circuit. But at the same time, there were a lot of other people within OCC going to other conferences. And one group that picked it up and really ran with it was our people over in the asset management area, the trust area, because it's so huge in that area, but also credit, of course, InfoSec, Kevin Greenfield, who's now the Director of Operational Risk Policy or the Deputy Comptroller, was overseeing the IT side for risk and FFIEC activity. And I mean, it was just.
It was a heady time because I have to tell you, John,
it was a heavy time.
Yeah, when that guidance came out, I was in corporate at the time. I was a chief procurement officer and head of third-party risk. And so, working in a major financial institution, which is a foreign-owned, systemically important financial institution in the US, was a wonderful, wonderful learning experience for me. And so that's where our paths first crossed, and we've become good friends over the years. But basically, here we are 10 years later, and the interagency guidance that has been published by jointly by the regulators, the OCC, the Federal Reserve Board, and the FDIC. Is this the first time that this type of guidance has been published as a collective?
Overall, no. There's been other interagency guidance, but yeah, just touching on the third party guidance. So, Linda, and the other thing, just Linda and I were involved with providing a response for comments with RMA, and I believe you provided your own.
I also submitted on my own because obviously the RMA, I mean, at the end of the day, there's certain points you would like to make. And I felt this participating in that working group with a joint response from the sector. And also it gave me an opportunity to individually submit. And I would encourage anybody, if there's some guidance out there that's out for comment that you're interested in, you know what, the regulators do listen. We were very pleased through the working group that many of the recommendations that we had made, in fact, found their way into the the final version of the guidance.
Yes. Yes.
So that actually was a great experience. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and just for the group, I think it's very beneficial to start from the beginning of the guidance and read the comments that were made, and then the agency's response on how they addressed each of the comments. There's a lot of good information in there.
Yeah, because basically, yeah. So the OCC, each of the regulators have published this guidance, and it looks a slightly different version. So what I have actually printed out for myself for reference was the one published by the Fed. It's SR, as in Sam Richard, 23-4. I have that one. I see you have yours too. I have that one because it doesn't have the preamble, and I find it just easier as a working document. If you want to know basically how the guidance got in the shape that it did from the 3 different publications into one, and what the comments were that were considered, the OCC guidance, in fact, has a very, very long preamble that introduces that. But let's dive right into the guidance itself, John, because there's a lot of things in here. So I wrote an article for Risk Management Journal, RMA Journal, that was published probably about a month or 2 ago. They're looking for perspective. My perspective personally is that it's no accident. It is 10 years after the original guidance was published by each of the individual regulators. And now 10 years later, it's coming into one guidance, the Interagency Guidance, which harmonizes the perspectives from across the regulatory bodies, and also, in my mind, raises the bar somewhat. So I'm thinking that, 10 years, it's 10 years. I'm thinking, John, that the examiners and regulators expect that what they told you to do 10 years ago, you're doing, right? And this is basically, there are some layers on top of what was already there to raise the bar somewhat. What are you thinking? You're from looking from the inside out, right? So you have that experience I don't.
Yes. Yeah, that I would say yes, that was the expectation. Not only the regulator, when I retired from OCC and got into consulting, that was still the assumption. The assumption was for the national banks. I'll say it that way. Because Brandon, you made a good point. OCC 2013-29 only applied to national banks. The industry was picking it up, not only the domestic, but the international as well. But yeah, just getting back to it, the assumption was that the banks would pick up the guidance, national banks, and run with it. And it was also in the OCC semi-annual risk perspective. Third party was one of the primary topics, the primary risks. And you would think that it would be picked up and run with, but surprisingly, and really getting down in the community bank levels where I was involved, very surprised how it really didn't get a lot of traction. I mean, what I saw in some cases, it was kind of referred to as just an IT issue.
And that's very true. And I think that's part of the challenge here, is that it does cover the spectrum of, the smallest to the largest.
Yes.
And so, as it's always been, the differences in the examination practices themselves, right? The expectations are at a higher level for the larger institutions.
Yeah.
So, it had been suggested to me that it would be very difficult for the community banks, a smaller organization. So whether you're a bank or not, if you're a smaller organization, could you comply with this? So I know you're writing an article for RMA Journal from a community bank perspective. And so you put a lot of thought into this, John. So what do you think the smaller banks could comply with the guidance?
And that's one thing, Linda, as it says in the guidance, this is a guidance. It's giving you recommendations, points to consider as you manage your program. I was going to say develop, but hopefully by now everybody has developed at least the initial program. Now it's how do you enhance the program? And there's a lot of good points in the interagency guidance that from when the OCC came out with 2013-29, then they came out with the FAQs. It was a great progression. Yeah, I shouldn't say it this way, but why did it take 10 years for the other agencies to all come together? But I will tell you, the FDIC had their own guidance and the Fed had their own guidance, and I did a mapping. And Linda, they were fairly close. Yes, there were gaps, but they were fairly close. Now, the Fed had a great point in theirs about contracting and using legal counsel. And I have
They
found,
also had about the incentive compensation, which I found interesting.
yes,
That was unique to the Federal Reserve Board. It wasn't mentioned specifically in the other guidance.
right. So, I mean, just it was just good though. I really was pleased to see when they came together to really just come up with a uniform guidance.
Mhm.
Now, we were chatting about this yesterday. It is a guidance, yes. So
I know, John, I know you come from a regulatory environment, and I have to
yeah,
say, you call it guidance when you have your examiners in front of you. They don't really treat it exactly as guidance. They want to know why you're not doing what it says in there. And the
yes,
expectation that this stuff ticks and ties is really, it is already there. Like I don't know what you see in your consulting, but in my consulting practice, most of the organizations that I deal with, of course, they have a program, right? So most organizations have something, whether it's just the IT component of it or whether it's more widespread. Where I think they're, organizations are the most challenged, and it doesn't matter what size you are, it's the integration, right? It's
oh,
all the touch points across because third party is every form of operational risk management. Only now you're looking outside the organization. And that's really that integration point is really where companies that I deal with, I continue to see them struggle. Right. So could you talk about some of the specifics? One of the things that I noticed having, again, maybe coming out of procurement, is that there is a real clear expectation that, for example, you're integrated with procurement. So what are your thoughts on that? Because sometimes it's like they're two islands. That's what I see in some places.
yeah, yeah. It really it comes down, Linda, to just having, and I'm going to call this having the nomenclature across the organization that
Mhm.
everybody is on the same page. Number one,
Yeah.
and then do the people in the different business units, do they understand, what is the risk? What's the activity, and how should this be managed? So, and that's where I have kind of seen the breakdown for my behalf is uh, third party risk management leaders and their teams have a good understanding. But the question is, how is that information relayed across the organization? In
Mhm.
other words, and I've had discussions with uh, networked out with my friends that are also in the business. Just do they get it? Do they understand? Do they know, what is the importance of procurement?
Mhm. And what
And
what is the role that they play in third party? Because, with
yes,
separation of duties and certain specialties, et cetera, I do see a number of instances where the folks in procurement really kind of do this to the risk side. Well, that's not really us. I mean, that's some other part of the organization. But I think that having a basic understanding of this. So we have a certified third party risk management professional program.
mhm,
And I have to say that we're beginning to see more people from procurement wanting to be certified, wanting to understand this, or at least to read the book. And I think that having that base of knowledge does allow them to actually have more career value, right? Because they understand how the component pieces fit together, but
yes,
also that everybody has a role to play. Because I think that's part of the challenge is that sometimes the silos are there because people are very, very busy in their jobs. There's no doubt.
yes,
And so they really want to focus on their component piece of it. But unless the pieces work together across the organization, you really can't have an effective program. So you had mentioned when we were speaking earlier that you were working with senior management and the board on strategy and how strategy is affecting third party. So
yes,
can you talk a little bit about that, please?
sure. But no, you made an exceptional point is breaking down the silos. I mean,
Hmm.
that I still see today. Everybody has
Oh,
their
me
blinders
too.
on, they're running at 100 miles an hour. But yeah, let's get to the guidance. And what I'm seeing is a lot of information on due diligence, no doubt
Yes.
about it. I mean, it's all out there. There's an interagency guidance on due diligence for fintechs. But take a step back, look at the life cycle, and that's planning.
Mhm.
How did this relationship come about? How did you decide to utilize this relationship? And it's what I just say, you need to tell your story. How did this all come about? I'll be honest with you, usually I find, oh yeah, we're doing due diligence, on these third parties, decide who we're going to use. The question is, well, how did you get there?
Mhm.
I mean, that's great.
Why are you using a third party? What are
Exactly.
they going to be doing for your organization? And why is that the choice that you've made? Because there are no two companies that are the same. The way they've
No.
decided to organize the work, what they do, what they rely on third parties to do, the business, the products, etc. There's no way that there's any two that are the same. So coming back to that, basically, it starts at the planning phase. And
Yeah,
so where does the board fit into the planning phase of this? Like, how deep should they go?
Yeah, the board should be informed. I mean, they definitely need to be informed. And taking a step back, one of the other activities I was involved in when I was at the OCC was I was on the group to draft the heightened standards.
Mhm.
And a key element for the board is you can inform them, but the question is, do they understand? And that's part of the heightened standards where it said establishing training. And oh my gosh, the feedback was unbelievable. Well, directors don't have the time to be attending, training seminars. No, it says they should have the appropriate knowledge. And in the third party space, they should be knowledgeable of the risk of utilizing third party relationships. But yeah, it all comes down, you go down the scale, you've got the board, then you've got executive management, senior management, line of business management. And at each level, the expectation is the fact that as you go down at the line of business level, they should have a firm knowledge, a very detailed technical knowledge. But yes, as you move up the ranks, yeah, you don't expect, and that's kind of some of the things reading about, well, the board should, direct or do this, do that. And it's like, that's a management role. But the
Well,
board
and
should be
yeah,
aware.
and I think that finding that line in the sand now, depending on your organization, my experience having worked for like a major bank that also had holdings with different boards, the boards for different parts, even of your own organization, will have different levels of involvement. So, for example, the mothership, I really did not report directly to the board. I reported to the risk committee of the board, whereas with some of the subsidiaries, I reported directly to the board in my capacity as head of third-party risk and
Right.
procurement. So knowing what to put in front of them is also something people do struggle with. And it bleeds into things like your key risk indicators, et cetera. So, what does your board really need to know? What does each, and as you've pointed out, there's different layers. What do they need to know in order to be effective in their roles? And so you have to really think about that.
Yes,
So
because
I just want to observe a comment here. Someone says,
Brandon made one.
Okay. Alrighty, so Brandon says, have you done an appropriate risk assessment of the risk associated with outsourcing a particular product or services, a critical part of an appropriate planning process? For board information, training, it's in, okay. So I like this question because one of the things that is coming into practice is a better job of segmenting relationships. And I do note that the interagency guidance recognizes that there are two fundamental ways that organizations do this. I think kind of the older version of this is blending together the concept of operational dependency, which is another word for criticality, with risk, right? So you're coming up with the one rating. I haven't done that for years and years. I don't think it's like super helpful. So the second way to do it, which is also sanctioned specifically in the guidance, is to be able to separate the concepts of operational dependency, which is another term for criticality, from exposure to risk. That segmentation allows you to have a better view of what's important to the organization and then what types of risks you face. So it's a long way of getting around to responding to Brandon's sort of question or comment.
Yes.
is really the risk associated with the product or service. The first thing you have to look is internally and say, what is our operational dependency? If you're in the financial services sector, this word criticality gives you no end of problems. I just have to say, because your IT people use it in one way, your business continuity management people use it in a different way, and you're showing up with the word criticality. So, yeah. So
Yeah.
It's an inward view. So can you talk about the difference between a critical provider or a critical third party and a critical activity, John? Because those are called out in the guidance, right? They are different.
Yeah, and that's, Linda, focusing on first the activity, assess the risk of the activity. And I just had a client, we did a huge business impact analysis, which is so beneficial because it tells you immediately, look at the RTO, the return on, return on operations. All right, what are those activities? That pretty well gives you an indication of what criticality is. Now, when I was I worked for a large bank for a while, they had identified components in terms of operational resiliency, which is mentioned in the new guidance, which is great. But also, and it also mentioned the guidance is your data. Who has your data? And how, how important is that? And for the large bank I worked with, we had well over 200 third-party relationships, of which the critical providers that we had, the ones that they performed an operational activity that was considered critical to the operation, or if they failed, what would be the impact on the bank? But also another component was just what data do they possess that could expose the institution to negative event being to reputation.
And that's like the two sides of the coin, right? So basically, what is the activity itself? What is the activity the bank is performing, and where does the third party fit in? And the other thing is, well, if we're doing business that's not with ourselves, what are the risks? How do they have our data? What are the controls, right? They are interchangeable, but not the same.
Correct.
So codependent and not the same.
Correct. Because you're always going to have the activity, whether internal or external. You're always going to have critical activities that you need to bring up. And really, from our business, the BIA we ran, Business Impact, we had a section on the reliance on third parties. But in the overall section, it just talks about what are the activities that are critical. I just want to jump back real quick, just mindful of time. When you talked about the board, what does the board need to know? And just realizing as the organization, the size and complexity, how much time do you have in front of a board to make a presentation?
Usually a matter of minutes. Make it count. Make everyone count.
Yes. So you have to develop presentation that you can get your key points across in a short manner of time, in a way that they understand and will take appropriate action. But Linda, you bring up a good point. With that, what are the top KRIs, KPIs? You're not gonna put a massive dashboard ahead of them. They want to know, okay, what are the big rocks here that could hurt us?
Right.
That's what they want to know. Get into the executive level, they're going to see more. I mean, they're going to have, more expansive reporting, and as you move down the scale. But I just want to bring that up. But now let's getting back to planning that you had mentioned here. Okay, you've identified hopefully in your plan, you've got a strategic plan. What are the activities? What product services you're going to offer? What's the criticality of those activities? And then how are we going to manage this? How are we going to roll this out? We're going to do it internally. We're going to have a third party assisting, or are we going to completely rely upon a third party? And for a critical third party. I think that just kind of has developed over time in the industry. We just call them critical third parties, but
and I find some of the terminology does confuse people, which why I've moved away from the term criticality is used extensively in guidance. But because it's used in many different ways in organizations, I have found it maybe not to be as helpful. And I've learned from working outside of the sector, right? So I work with different types in different sectors with different types of companies. So I've learned to simplify my own language, which is why I moved away from criticality into operational dependence. People do understand that. And so, I did a little range of practice survey for a client over the last couple of weeks, asking, what do you mean by critical? What do you mean by outsourcing, et cetera, trying to get a handle on it. And in the long run, anything that's in a managed program has some degree of criticality, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. And so when you start to think about, well, what do different layers need to know? Breaking it down in the segmentation does help, right? Because that notion of mission critical or enterprise critical, it's all about the impact on your organization if something goes horribly wrong. And the guys at the top of the pile on your third party list would bring the whole bank to its knees if things went wrong. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, it needs to be managed, but it's not going to, it's not going to cause irreparable harm. And so getting that scale in place makes a big difference. And so when you start to look at the critical activities, one of the things, I don't know if you've seen this, but I see this pretty extensively, that the business continuity management function is still going through a maturity process, right, with most organizations. So things like recovery time objectives or, the ranking of what's a critical product or service isn't necessarily mature in organizations. And that makes it harder for people in third party to do their job, because if you could just hang your stuff on that, then it's a lot easier to say, well, we've already decided these are critical products, critical activities, et cetera, because of other criteria. And now we can look and see what supports it from outside the organization. Are there any single points of failure? What happens if they exceed the recovery time objectives? But if that program isn't mature, and it's not in most organizations I run into, it just makes it harder to get there.
Yeah, and again, Linda, we're getting back to the silos. Break the silos down, leverage the expertise across the organization. I mean, there doesn't say expectation that your third-party risk management group should know all the technicalities from every activity. And that's where I see they're focused so hard on, and I'm going to say it, they're focused so hard on treating this like a compliance exercise, filling everything out. They're so focused on that, they don't think about the fact, okay, what are our top priorities here? What do we need to really address right now? Because, as you say, the criticality that's most important, and then go down, the level of risk. And what I see what's going on, both from the examiner in the banking and now consulting field, is, do you have clearly defined processes to categorize the risk?
Yeah. And that is, interestingly enough, I would have thought that by now, pretty much everybody, at least in the financial services sector, would be running to residual risk. And so residual risk is really after you go through and look at the control environment at the third party, what's left? What is the risk that's left after you assess those controls? And generally speaking, you want it to be low. You want to see the controls you expect. But I can't even tell you how many times I run into, trying to manage to inherent risk, which is any risk you could be exposed to regardless of the control environment, which makes it very hard to focus on where do we need to spend our resources. You told me that something a long time ago, which I really did take to heart. And you said that basically from an examiner's perspective or an auditor's perspective, they're looking for best use of resources, right? So it's not like you have to do everything for everything all the time. So can you just talk a little bit about sort of good use of resources to make good choices on how you spend your time?
And, Lynn, I think, and I'm going to drive this home this way. I think overall, people do a pretty good job of kind of determining the best way to utilize their resources. I mean, there's a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings. Where does it break down when you look at auditors and regulators? And it's in your article as well as in the guidance, and that is, you need to tell your story. You need to document. You need to support why you came up with these assumptions. And what's also important is in situations where you have come together with the right people at the table in your bank and say, okay, we're going to accept this risk and here's why.
Right. And that does not mean chucking it over your shoulder to say, oh, we couldn't get the due diligence done or whatever. So the business will accept the risk, right? That is like, I hate that answer because that's not the right answer, right?
No.
So it does take courage to be in a risk specialty job, right? You have to be able to stand up and be candid and say, I don't think this risk is acceptable for the organization. We will need to escalate this for exception approval. But I see too many times that people just chuck it over their shoulder and say the business will accept the risk, right? And that is kind of wrong-headedness because we're all supposed to be pulling in the same direction.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you bring up the point, and from my practical experience, that group I worked for had a third-party risk committee,
Mhm.
and it met. I think it was trying to meet monthly, sometimes every other month, but no more than once a quarter. But third-party risk committee was made up of selected execs and frontline management.
Mhm.
And the goal was to, number one, bring to the committee any exceptions to policy procedures, any key exceptions that would be brought in front of them. There
Mhm.
would be a format that the vendor manager would have to complete, and then vendor risk manager, I'm sorry, what would we call it? We'll call it third-party risk management. So we were the
Yep.
second line that would review it and concur and then present it to the third-party risk committee. Now, these are the execs. They've looked at, the case,
Mhm.
and the decision could make one of three decisions. Do they accept the risk? Do they recommend remediating the risk? Or, and it was rare, but it could be, do we need to terminate this relationship and find another third party?
Right. And you're right. That is a fairly rare thing. So, I mean, as silly as it sounds, when I wrote my first book, what do you really learn? I learned get in business with the right third party in the first place, because it's pain on wheels trying to get back out again. Right. So I hear I hear from art students and I hear from a lot of people how the business gives them the hard time about how long it takes and why are you doing all this? And we've never had a problem before. But the truth of the matter is that if you don't get into business with the right third party in the first place, you got a problem. Now, I'd like to go back to the guidance. One of the things that really caught my attention in the interagency guidance is the expectations around sanctions. So sanction screening, right? So the sanction screening actually goes all the way to, I've done range of practice surveys, et cetera. But when you're looking at sanctions, country is easy, right? The sanction country list is easy to find. Every government publishes countries you can't do business with, and it's a short list.
Yes.
Right. So then basically you have the OFAC screening, that's public information, et cetera. But the companies are doing business around the world now, and that's really not good enough. You need to look, in my opinion, past the OFAC list, because if they're sanctioned somewhere else and you're going to be doing business, it's just going to cause you problems in the long run. So what I recommend to people is you're also now supposed to be looking at directors and officers, right? So that's an interesting addition. And then the realizing on the cake is called ultimate beneficial ownership. So
Yes.
who actually owns this organization in the long run? And let me just point out, in the US, that is almost impossible to know the answer to. In other countries, it's much more difficult to build these shell companies where you can't really see who's what. And so, but in the US, it's very easy. And I've heard of live examples where they thought they were contracting with one company. It turned out the IP was owned by somebody else, and the service is going to be delivered elsewhere. Right. So that UBO is kind of the ultimate. I would remind you that, John, you have said yourself, it's the word consider is in there. It very rarely tells you must. So when the word consider is there, if you're not going to be doing something, you should actually write it down and explain why you're not doing it and get it signed off by somebody who has the authority to agree.
Yes. Yes.
But when it comes to it, basically, what I've been recommending to organizations is when you're looking at, I do think that you have some reliance rationale, right? I work for different stock exchanges. I happen to know for a fact that anything that's traded on the exchanges, they have to run through the list of officers and directors, et cetera, all the time because of AML laws, right? So, and you might be able to feel comfortable with the reliance rationale if it's publicly traded in almost all the stock exchanges in the world. But when it comes to privately owned, totally different deal. So what my recommendation there is that you really should be doing this. You should be looking at directors and officers because the bad guys can hide in the director chair, not in the front line.
Yes.
And understanding who the directors are and running them through the screening, and also looking at 3 key roles. And so you've got CEO, CFO, and I think you should have the head of technology, right? And I think that those 3 officers, if there's something bad hiding, they're going to have one of those positions of authority. So this is really, it is heightened guidance. I actually strongly recommend that for privately owned that you take that step. You're going to have to ask them who, for a list of who these people are, but it would be definitely your best interest to find out, because we have learned from hard experience that, the fourth parties, the small companies, et cetera, those are where the problems are coming from. It's not the big guys. Let's be serious. Most of these big companies are publicly traded. They have too much to lose. But the small companies are where interesting things can hide. So
yes,
that's my soapbox. I'm done.
Well, no, and no, it's great. We just recently, one of our clients asked us to assist them in doing a due diligence review. Now I'll be, and this is something that I find not uncommon, let me say it this way, but you've got a group performing a due diligence review, an activity that's already been accepted.
Yep.
Which, well, what if you come up with something negative? What are you going to do? You've already moved into the contract space.
Well, that's a silly time to be doing due diligence, right?
That's silly time
after you sign the contract.
Exactly.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
But this is where, do you have that executive committee where you come in and go, well, we didn't have a chance for the due diligence because somebody on the executive side might have already contracting the bill or committed to do the business with them. Yep. And, for the protection of third-party risk manager, you bring it to that committee and say, here's the situation. Yep. At this point, do you accept that risk, or how are we going to remediate it? It doesn't sound like you're going to be able to terminate. So, it's just bring it up and record it that, we'll go ahead and run the due diligence, but it's already been accepted, been brought on board. We just did one recently. Another good friend of mine ran an extensive due diligence on it's a payday lender, and going through, he went through and got into some of the industry applications and did searching and found out that the CEO also had other ownership interests in other groups. And then, of course, surprisingly, this person joined the board.
Yeah, and it illustrates the point loud and clear that when you think about where the breaches are coming from these days, it really is, it's not usually, these big companies are, in some cases, they have better controls than their clients, right? I was having this conversation just yesterday about some of the big offshore providers, right? They basically, in many cases, have unbelievably good controls. It doesn't mean you shouldn't check, and it doesn't mean that there are things that are going wrong. And surprisingly, I did, as I mentioned, I did this little range of practice survey. I was quite surprised to find out that there are still people with access to confidential information who are working from home in some of these other countries. Like, have you never been there? Right? Yeah. Some of the working environment, you would not want your client's data to be sitting out on the dining room table in a very, very crowded home, right? That just is kind of silly. So if you have not come up with a return to work plan for your third parties, I recommend that you go there, because there is some safety in numbers. But anyhow, so I want to go back to the guidance itself. And if anybody has any questions, please just put them in the chat or put your hand up, and we're happy to give you some airtime here. But basically, one of the things that it talks to as well in the guidance, John, is talking about having the right skills and expertise for people to be able to do their jobs.
Exactly.
So, well, what does that mean? I mean, wouldn't you assume that people are in their jobs because they know what they're doing?
You want the regulator answer, or do you want the actual true to life answer? I mean,
I like the true to life one. What
true to
the
life
heck?
answer. Okay, I was involved in a review of a fairly large bank, and the person that was in the position, he was a third-party risk management leader, vendor management leader, whatever you want to call him. And the question is, well, what was his background? And we finally got the story that this individual kind of needed to find a spot in the organization. And
Oh my God,
they
there they
put the
are. Look,
person
there's an
there.
open job there, and this isn't that important. We could put them in there, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but at least
yeah.
I wish, just if they would have just at least read the guidance at that time, read, they were a state member bank, so reading the Fed guidance, they could have read, but it was clear just in our discussion, this individual really, their role was just, we got this third-party software program, and my job is just get the information and keep the program updated.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, right? Because what we see in our course, right? We've had hundreds of people through the certification program. I can't even tell you how often it is it's the team and not the leader that goes through. And I find that really interesting because we've never had anybody come through and say, gosh, I already knew all that. Right. So we've never ever had that response from anybody. So to me, basically, you look at cybersecurity people, there's an expectation they have some certification. And I think it's coming in other areas. We're starting to see different credentialing across different specialties. But when I see the senior people, right, they're very often parachuted into the job because they're good leaders without the subject matter knowledge. And I mean, this is not an uncomplicated discipline. So it's very difficult for them to be able to ask the right questions if they don't really understand the topic. Because I can't even tell you how many times in front of like even a CRO or head of ops risk, it takes a while for the penny to drop to say, listen, this is touching every part of our organization. Just about every function in the entire organization, no matter what industry you're in, has some interaction with third parties and therefore third-party risk. And so the most common reaction at the senior level is, well, I told you to create a program 2 weeks ago, aren't you done yet? Right. So, to put a good program in place, you're looking at, minimum 4 to 6 months build. And then even to go through, and I mean, I do a lot of assessments to say, how do you make this better? And what do I recommend you do first? Even those will take 4 to 6 weeks just to go through and understand all the component pieces. And when you're from outside looking in, it's a lot easier to see, well, gosh, this is out of sequence here, or this doesn't talk to that, or you're using different terminology for similar things. How many times have you seen the descriptions of risk ratings different across the functions? I mean, 10, 100?
Yeah. I mean, just you would think at least they would have at least the same levels, but yeah, they're disjointed. There's, like I say, it's everybody operates in their own silo. You need to break that down and get that uniformity, across the organization, and then get that done, and then come up with accurate parameters to be able to evaluate that risk.
And I think that's another good point, John, is really defining the control environment. What are the controls that you expect, right? So I was dealing with one organization last year, and they were looking at 874 controls, right, which I thought was kind of excessive. And even their light version was around 450. And, at the end of the day, there are certain controls that really, if they're not there or they're deficient, they're going to have a huge impact. So you don't have to you don't have to kill yourself doing this, but being able to define the controls that are important to your organization and know how to evaluate them in a consistent way. It's table stakes, right? I mean, this interagency guidance is 10 years after the original. So if you don't have those basics sorted out, my guess is we're going to start seeing a new wave of MRAs. But that's just my opinion. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. I was a little surprised, I'll be honest with you, when the new guidance came out. Usually, the regulatory agencies will put that in their supervisory plans. Now, I looked at the agency's plans for, this year, I was taken aback a little bit that the interagency guidance was not addressed. I mean, they addressed certain areas, but what I'm thinking is maybe they're allowing a little time for our community banks to let this soak in.
Possibly,
But as far as banks go, keep an eye out when the regulatory agency comes out with their supervisory plan for the year. I mean, that right there is just, they're handing you, I mean,
they're handing
really,
you a roadmap to say, we're going to be looking at this stuff.
They're handing you the alert of this is what you better be prepared for. Now, the other thing with MRAs, MRIAs, and we chatted this before, they just don't come out of nowhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I asked you, could they go right to MRIA? And you said not a chance, right? So maybe you could share your advice as a former regulator.
Yeah, and MRI, they do not come out of nowhere unless you surprise the regulators. And it's the same thing.
Or something really bad.
You don't want to surprise them, but sometimes if they uncover an activity that people in the bank really didn't have any management over, any control over, yes, it could immediately come about. And the thing is, though, for most of the regulatory activities, they're going to start with discussions, making remarks, and that's what's really important too. Is when you're at the table with the regulators, you keep solid notes of what's being discussed, because it won't be in the report of exam, but trust me, it will be noted in their records. And make a note of that, guys. They just kind of gave us a little gift here that we need to focus on this before they come in next time. Now, the other thing as well that I hear now, I'm in this space now as consultant, is banks saying, well, I don't understand that. Our last exam, we came through clean as can be. And now this one, oh my gosh, they're just tearing us apart. And it's just, don't assume because you don't get it one exam, it may pop up the next, because of the fact people change. And you're going to have people with
the examiners. Yep, you get different examiners with a different focus, but also, I mean, you're right, John. They're in the discussions. They may giving you an early warning and a heads up without actually writing you up for it. But if they see that same thing when they come back in, that's when to expect that it may well escalate at that point.
True.
So
and that's And the other thing is, and you brought up is, and how are we doing on time?
Well, we're pretty much here. I just want to ask you one other question. One of the things that I asked you before we started was about fintechs, right? Because it specifically mentions fintechs, which is a term that confuses me, because fintechs are companies that offer technology to the sector. Like, who doesn't? Who would you have with your third party program that doesn't have some form of technology?
Yes. And I have a client right now, Linda, that develops applications. They're front end applications for community banks and credit unions.
Yep.
And all, they don't offer any technology servicing, but they do offer the applications through a technology service provider. So again, it is a technology component that, and I know just from dealing with this client, their clients, the community banks, are always in asking for the ongoing monitoring information that would be expected, the SOC 2 financials, what are the controls, insurance, which is brought up in this guidance, so they're asking specific questions. And I will say, when you are doing your due diligence, one of the key things that you can immediately start out with and go, okay, what's a positive point with a third party that we're looking at, is if they provide you with already their own developed due diligence package. And that just tells you, okay, these people are on point. They know, they've read the guidance as well. They know what they need to provide. So if you're talking to third party and they're going, well, why do you need all this? You might need to step back and go, okay, they don't really understand the risk in the relationship. You do, but does your third party really understand this risk?
Well, Well, and my personal experience dealing with sometimes with third parties themselves, a lot of them are paying lip service to this, right? They just want to get past the, your due diligence and get to contract, right? And whatever that means, that they don't understand how important this is to, especially to the financial services sector. And that is something to be mindful of. So it's a good sign if they have a package, but a lot of times, basically, it really is, it's not a top item for their management to have the best possible controls. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up there. Do you have any final words, John? Because I mean, I love talking to you. You are just so knowledgeable. So do you have any one nugget of advice to share?
The key thing, Linda, is for everybody here, network. I mean, that's huge. G-Core is coming up. I mean, there's all kinds of, just.
Oh, yes, I'm speaking at G-Core, by the way.
Oh, you are?
I am, yep.
Good for you. But yeah, network. You're not in this alone. That's what I've always said. You're not in this alone. Everybody else is probably having the same difficulties. Network with your group and share thoughts. The RMA roundtable that we discussed earlier. I mean, that is so key. I think where people get frustrated, they're there trying to do all this by themselves, and they need to build out that network. How do you get that network? Yeah, attending some conferences. And you don't have to be in person, but just getting to see some names. I mean, like right now, I'm looking at all the folks that are on this call. And can these people reach out to the people on this call and just say, hey, what do you see about this?
And we will broker that conversation. We're happy to do it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, okay. So we have a comment here about same challenges and best practices. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. In the sector, that is true, right? You have to document everything. I have a client right now. I keep saying, you have some good practices, but because they're not written down, it's not too obvious to your examiner that they're there, right? Correct. So yeah. Okay. Well, I want to thank you, John. I love talking to you. I look forward to our next conversation, either on Ask the Expert with Third Party Risk Institute, or certainly when you take my call, which I appreciate you always do. Okay, so thank you for joining us, everyone. This will be posted on in our resource center, but also on our YouTube channel. So this is Linda Tuck Chapman again from Third Party Risk Institute, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.